Hello there and welcome. This is the lesson recording for 2.05, A Long War. When the American Revolution began, the British thought it would be a brief uprising in New England. But George Washington and the small ragtag army of patriots were determined. The Continental Army gradually grew into a disciplined military force. It endured years of terrible hardship. After fighting ended in a stalemate in the middle colonies, the war moved to the southern colonies. With help from the French, the Patriots finally emerged victorious. A large measure of their success was due to the remarkable leadership of George Washington, who worked tirelessly on both the military and political fronts. And then goals for this lesson. Demonstrate mastery of important knowledge and skills learned in previous lessons. Identify major events, leaders, and foreign assistance during the American Revolution. Describe George Washington's role in winning the War of Independence. Explain how the United States was able to achieve victory in the Revolutionary War. Identify major events and leaders of the American Revolution. Describe Washington's strategy for winning the war. And assess George Washington's role in the American Revolution. Don't forget to go to lesson resources and get your materials, your reading guide, and your lesson answer key. And lesson answer key. Okay. Read pages 670 through 679. Complete the Revolution in the South sheet. Complete the Tracking the Revolution in the South online. Identify the revolutionary leaders in the online flashcards. Read the Chapter 6 highlights and take the online quiz. So let's start with the lesson reading on page 160. Turning south. I was starting with that section here. In Britain, the civilian population was beginning to grow weary of what felt like an increasingly long and costly war. Although some advisors urged King George to negotiate a peace, he was determined not to lose the 13 colonies. If they were to go, then what might that mean for Britain's other colonial possessions, such as India or Canada? In the winter of 1777 through 78, members of Parliament proposed a plan to end the war and save face. England would undo all the laws it had passed in 1763 that so angered the colonists. In exchange, Parliament hoped the colonists would take back their Declaration of Independence. But this proposal was too little, too late. Like the video, too late to apologize, King George. We are moving on with independence. The British take Savannah and Charleston. After the draw at Monmouth Courthouse in the summer of 1778, the British decided to win the war by focusing on the South. The British believed mistakenly that most Southerners were loyalists who would support the Redcoats. General Henry Clinton hoped that he would score easy victories in the Carolinas and Georgia, and then with the support of Southern loyalists turn north to Virginia and defeat Washington in his home state. For a while it looked as though the British would meet with success in their southern campaign. Two key southern cities fell to the British: Savannah, Georgia, and later Charleston, South Carolina. The capture of Charleston seemed to be an especially deadly blow to the Patriots. In Parliament, many rejoiced that the war was finally over. Clinton himself was confident enough to return to New York, leaving General Cornwallis in charge of British forces in the South. In August 1780, Cornwallis defeated a battalion of Continental soldiers under the leadership of General Horatio Gates at Camden, South Carolina. Still in the Carolinas, the British met with more resistance than they had anticipated. As the British commandeered supplies and plundered farms, locals in South Carolina supported men like Lieutenant Colonel Francis Marion. Still smarting from the defeat at Charleston, Marion organized a band of men to fight the British from the interior. They specialized in techniques of guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run ambushes and raids, quick surprise attacks, and equally rapid withdrawals. Though the British tried to track Marion down, he and his men used swamp trails to cover their tracks. The strategy gave Marion his nickname, the Swamp Fox. From the Carolinas to Virginia. After the victories at Charleston and Camden, the British stumbled in the South. In the fall of 1780, Washington named a superb tactician, Nathanael Greene, to replace Horatio Gates as head of the Continental forces in the South. Greene divided the Continental Army and scored two quick victories in the Carolinas. In January 1781, at Cowpen, South Carolina, Patriots led by Daniel Morgan defeated British troops led by Lord Charles Cornwallis. In March, Greene himself won a victory in North Carolina at Gulliford Courthouse, where the British captured the battlefield but lost many more men than the Americans. The nearby town of Greensboro was named in Greene's honor. After these American victories, Cornwallis decided against further action in the Carolinas and turned instead to Virginia. And there's just a picture there of the battle. On to the next page. Virginia's government was unprepared for a British attack. In December 1780, Benedict Arnold, who had switched his allegiance from America to Britain, and we'll read about that in the excerpt, led British troops into Virginia and took the capital city, Richmond. Virginia's governor, Thomas Jefferson, and other government officials were forced to flee. In the spring of 1781, Cornwallis took command of over 7,000 British troops in Virginia. Only about 2,000 Continental soldiers opposed them. Under the leadership of Lafayette and von Steuben, the outnumbered American forces could do little more than buzz around the British forces like the mosquitoes that filled the thick southern air. On May 31, 1781, Cornwallis sent cavalry led by Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton into the heart of Virginia to capture the state government. A Virginia soldier named Jack Jouett was sitting in a nearby tavern in nearby Louisa County when he saw the British troops appear. Like a Southern Paul Revere, he rode 40 miles to Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, to warn the governor. Jefferson, with his wife and children, escaped over the Blue Ridge Mountains to nearby Staunton. Tarleton moved into Jefferson's beloved Monticello for a few days, during which some of Jefferson's slaves escaped to freedom. Victory at Yorktown. Oh, let's read about Benedict Arnold here, shall we? Benedict Arnold, traitor. In the fall of 1780, Benedict Arnold, the Connecticut-born soldier who had distinguished himself at Fort Ticonderoga in the Battle of Saratoga, was revealed to be a spy. A difficult man, highly convinced of his own merits, Arnold, frustrated by his inability to advance the American army, plotted with British Major John Andre to help the Redcoats capture the American outpost at West Point. When Arnold learned that he had been found out, he simply joined the British Army, and they promptly made him a general. Ever since, his name has been a synonym for traitor. So if anybody ever calls you a Benedict Arnold, they mean you're a traitor. Victory at Yorktown. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis had moved his 7,500 men to Yorktown, Virginia. Lafayette's troops kept a watchful eye on them. In New York, General Washington awaited the arrival of a French fleet to assist in what he hoped would be the final campaign against General Clinton's British forces in the South. In August 1781, Washington received word that a French fleet was sailing toward the Chesapeake Bay. He recognized the opportunity. Rather than attack Clinton's forces in New York, Washington ordered the Continental Army to head south. The plan was carried out with great secrecy since Washington wanted Clinton to think that the Americans still planned to focus their campaign in New York. None of the troops knew where they were going as they marched south towards Yorktown. From siege to surrender. Marching with Washington's men was a recently arrived and much-needed French force, some 5,000 men led by General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau. Washington also ordered American troops led by Anthony Wayne to proceed to Virginia. As these two fighting forces converged in Yorktown, they were joined by a third. Luckily, the French fleet arrived in the Chesapeake Bay just as Washington's Continental forces were in place. By the end of September 1781, American and French troops at Yorktown numbered about 17,000 against 8,000 British and Hessian troops. The Continental troops had the British hemmed in by land, while the French fleet kept the British from fleeing by sea. Cornwallis and his men were trapped. Although besieged, the British would not surrender. American and French forces began a heavy bombardment of Yorktown on October 9th. With his men sick, dying, and running low on supplies, Cornwallis sent a letter to Washington proposing that they meet to discuss terms of surrender. The formal surrender took place on October 19th. Tradition holds that during the surrender ceremony, a British band played a popular song called The World Turned Upside Down. It surely must have seemed to the British, and perhaps to some Americans as well, that the world had indeed turned upside down. After almost 7 years of fighting, the greatest army and navy in the world had been beaten by a group of untrained but eager young men whom George Washington, with help from French and Prussian friends, had fashioned into a dedicated fighting force. The Treaty of Paris. After Yorktown, a few more scattered battles took place, but the war was essentially over. Within weeks of Cornwallis' surrender, Loyalists began fleeing to Canada. The outcome at Yorktown convinced Parliament to vote against continuing so costly a war. Frustrated, King George sent ministers to negotiate a final peace with the Americans. The long negotiations took place in Paris. The Americans were represented by John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay. Discussions began on April 1782. At last, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. In the treaty, Britain formally recognized the United States as a free sovereign and independent states. The treaty highly favored the new United States, giving it control over not just the original 13 colonies, but all land from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean and from Canada to Spanish Florida. The British agreed to withdraw their forces. In exchange, the Americans agreed that the British could collect on American... that's just an excerpt that you can read on their own. Skip to the page that I need to finish my sentence. to collect on American debts and that Congress would recommend to the states that Loyalists would get back their confiscated property. French officials were not entirely happy with the treaty. They wanted the United States to have less access to Western land. The British, in turn, wanted the United States to have more restricted fishing rights. But Adams, Franklin, and Jay felt it was their duty to negotiate the best possible treaty for the new nation. Farewells and prospects. Even as the Treaty of Paris was being negotiated, the new nation faced challenges. Congress continued to struggle financially. The government had still no reliable way to raise money, but many Continental soldiers had not been paid. Some of Washington's men were frustrated and angry. They feared that they had fought a war to create a country that would not be able to govern itself. One soldier even suggested that Washington lead a revolt against Congress and install himself as America's new king. Washington was so frustrated with Congress's inability to raise money. Washington was also frustrated with Congress's inability to raise money, but he reminded the soldiers that they had fought the revolution to create a republic, a country in which men could govern themselves. He refused to march against the government he had fought to create. Washington bids farewell to his troops. In November 1783, when Washington received word that the Treaty of Paris was signed, he began the process of saying goodbye to his military life. On November 2nd, near Princeton, he addressed his soldiers, whom he called one patriotic band of brothers. The time has come, said Washington, for him to bid them an affectionate, a long farewell. He told his men that creating a new self-governing country would not be easy. While the military battles had been long and hard, he said, they now faced the hard work of creating a free and self-governing nation. He urged his men to be virtuous and useful citizens, just as they had been virtuous and useful soldiers. The next morning, Washington traveled to Annapolis, Maryland. There, on December 23rd, he stood before the Continental Congress and formally resigned his military post. In a speech to his former colleagues, Washington spoke of the men in the Army as his family. The speech moved his compatriots to tears. Washington was looking forward to a quiet retirement with his wife Martha on their plantation, Mount Vernon. Like so many Americans, he was uncertain what the future would hold, but hopeful that the young nation's best days lay well in the future. Main reasons for the American victory. Why did the Americans win the war for independence against the strongest nation in the Western world? One big reason was geography. 3,000 miles of ocean was a daunting distance for British ships to transport a large army, keep it supplied, and bring in replacements as needed. The American rebels, in contrast, were fighting on their own land over a vast amount of space. American victory also owed much aid from other nations, especially the French, eager to revenge their defeat in the 7 Years' War. Without the money, troops, and naval support that the French provided, the American cause might well have failed. Although American leaders made serious mistakes during the course of the Revolution, they rose to the challenge, and none more so than George Washington. Perhaps most important of all, however, was not the effort of any individual, but the spirit of the people, as many Americans dedicated themselves to the revolutionary effort. Yes, there were the Sunshine Patriots and summer soldiers that Thomas Paine scorned, as well as many Tories who remained loyal to Britain. In the end, however, there was enough Americans who regarded themselves as a separate people, entitled to their own nation, and were willing to fight and die for the cause of independence. And then here's just Washington's farewell order that's included there. You can read through on your own. And then we're at the end of the lesson, so let's go back. So now we have to look at the other parts of today's lesson. And you have an activity to complete here. Tracking the Revolution in the South, so you can complete that activity. And then also the Revolutionary Leaders flashcards is another activity you can do. And you just simply, why can't I move this up? I'm trying to move this up and it's not working very well. But you just flip over the flashcards to work on that. And then finally, at the end, you have the Chapter 6 highlights that you also can read through. That just summarizes the last few lessons. And that's a good summary and a good review to go into the 2.05 quiz. So good luck on your quiz and do your best.